So it's late night post, but I did say on my Facebook page that I would make this video, so here we go. In light of Rogue One being out and being awesome, of course people are talking about it, and inevitably there's going to be those folks who chime in and want to say that Rogue One, or pretty much any Star Wars film, is not good, bullshit, boring, or they just don't like the franchise. And typically, these folks who tend to say this, 9 times out of 10, don't really have much of an explanation as to why they feel this way. And I've found that most folks who make this claim have never seen Star Wars day in their life. And usually they'll end up following up their statement by pulling Star Trek into the conversation. So really, their argument is just that they don't like sci-fi, fantasy, or science fiction. So specifically to this statement, I would look and say, well, look, you shouldn't speak on things you don't know anything about, because all it does is show how uninformed and how ignorant you are. Now, some people might look and say, stop being so serious, and I'm like, well, there are times where you should be serious, because on a greater point, is it just a movie? Yes, it is just a movie, but this points to a greater issue with the fact that people want to degrade or dismiss or just kind of throw to the wolves the notion of something that they can't understand and say that it's wasteful or say that it's useless. Just because you don't understand it doesn't mean that it isn't useful. Science fiction is usually the birthplace of science fact. Usually. People who want to throw Star Trek to the wolves and say that it's a waste of time, that it's bullshit, it's boring. You wouldn't have your smartphones, you wouldn't have your tablets, you wouldn't have any of your modern technology if it weren't for shows like Star Trek. Because that's where we've gotten all the inspiration for all of these inventions was from science fiction. And that's not just in Star Trek, that's in the entire science fiction genre. From Asimov to Wells to Roddenberry, I mean, really, the plethora of inspiration for invention, for motivation and endeavor for creation within the realm of science, and that's not just in technology, that's also in chemistry and biology. It's amazing what we've done with leaps and bounds, and a lot of it was inspired by science fiction. But Star Wars is not Star Trek. Star Trek is science fiction. Star Wars is science fantasy. It's Lord of the Rings in space. These fantastical ships. I mean, how fantastic is it? It's a futuristic, galactic, interstellar story, and instead of blasters, the most elite fighters use laser swords. I mean, that's absolute fantasy right then and there. But more than that, Star Wars tells an amazing story that if you take away the lightsabers, if you take away the fantasy aspect of it, it's a very relatable and very real story. The struggle of individuals within the story, the struggle on the greater level of society being split in two. The oppressed and the oppressor. That's the empire for those who can't keep up. And the rebellion. And then there's everybody in between, because you definitely have those people within the Star Wars stories who are apathetic. They're literally like the status quo. I just keep my head down and take care of me. Do we not have that happening in real life? Hello? But in all fairness, Star Wars and Star Trek are not the same thing. They're not even the same types of stories. But I think people who want to spout out these dismissive and harsh judgments are solely coming from really a place of a lack of understanding. Of course, ignorance. But I think that might also be because maybe they feel they can't follow the stories. Maybe they feel a little overwhelmed. And that's not necessarily something to be ashamed of, but that doesn't mean go and shame the folks who do watch it and do follow the stories and do know all of that. Those folks who make these statements are also those individuals who tend to throw the term nerd around like somehow it's still some sort of insult. Not anymore. Being a nerd is pretty awesome. But I have to look and say if you're falling back to name calling, especially with the term nerd, and you somehow think that nerds don't get laid or don't have sex lives or don't date or don't have relationships, you haven't been keeping up on current events because nerds are winning. Yep. On top of that, I mean, I think if someone had the patience to sit down and explain to these folks what the storyline really is trying to tell, because I definitely did that. And really the whole inspiration for this conversation was because of another conversation that a friend of mine was having, where someone literally just chastised the whole Star Wars franchise and threw Star Trek under the bus as well. And you could tell simply because there was no explanation that went with it, that this was solely from a place of, I don't know it, I don't understand it, so it's bullshit. Why? Why do you feel that way? And if someone were to turn around and say, well, why are you so passionate about it? Because I grew up on these stories and they affected my life in the most positive way possible. Science fiction and science fantasy motivates, it inspires, it uplifts. I saw women in leadership roles. I saw women of color in leadership roles. I saw them in command. I was like, I can do that. If they can do it in a story, why can't I do it in real life? You know? They were science officers. They were communications officers. They were leaders. They were politicians. I mean, come on. That was a big deal back then for me as a kid, and that's still a big deal. Representation matters growing up. If you see someone who looks like you, someone who falls into the same category as you, doing the things that somehow society is telling you, nah, you can't achieve it, that's inspiring to let you know, yeah, you can. Yes, it's a fictional story, but the motivation is real. The feeling and the emotion behind it, that can be a real thing. The creativity that goes into writing these stories is a very real thing. And how is that not a good thing? I think a lot of times folks who throw science fiction and science fantasy, into the stuff I don't feel like dealing with pile, they're losing out and probably missing out on the imagination that maybe they lost out on in their childhood. And that's a pretty sad way to be. But being an adult and being a Star Wars fan is a pretty awesome feeling. I understand the stories way more now that I'm an adult than I was when I was a kid. I enjoy it more now than I ever did. I go to conventions, I have a ball. Cosplay, I have a ball. It's so much fun. And call me a nerd all you want. That's not an insult to me. I wear that joint proud. That's a proud badge for me. So this has now gone on 8.5 minutes too long. So with that being said, it's now midnight. Thanks for listening to my long drawn out statement and sort of a rant. Peace out.